If I were a character and my life was a tragedy, then I guess my fatal flaw would be my desire to be understood. I try to be as transparent as possible, revealing the innermost parts of my heart, all in an attempt to connect with those around me. This is the story of two men and two boys, my father and I.
Some prerogatives for mysteries, qualifiers, about 4 or 5 of them.
When I was younger, I wasn't sure of who I wanted to be, but I knew what I was expected to become.
I have made up my mind that you cannot bring out bitterness out of me.
Given my father's name, and at the time being his only son, I was the heir to his legacy.
You're going to have love come out of me.
I was told that one day I would inherit his ministry and become a pastor. It was never a matter of if, but when.
When we began, you remember when we began 20 years ago, and I'm like, and when I came out, and I'm like, it's going to be a mega church overnight.
It was his life's work, and as he always says, there's no success without a successor.
I'm about to jump out of my skin to say to you, the devil is a liar!
I was expected to fit into his mold, but as a kid, my will grew resistant. So I rebelled in an attempt to define myself as an individual. But my rebellion was met with discipline, and discipline always included discipling. There was a Joshua 24 for every fight, a Proverbs 13:24 for every suspension. I recited the sinner's prayer more times than I could count, but with every resuscitation, my will grew more rigid in my fight against erasure. At a point, he depended on fear, but fear taught me resentment against both my father and God. Last summer, I moved back home, and for the first time in my adult life, I felt like that child again. For years, my father spoke of traveling with me back home to show me the land of our fathers. This past summer, the opportunity finally presented itself through the death of my cousin Princewill. This was no vacation. And to make matters worse, my father was struggling to figure out how to relate with me as an adult while maintaining his parental authority. Every time we disagree as adults, he reminded me that he's not only my father, but my pastor. Because in his words, he was still raising me.
What about school?
We arrived in Lagos on the 27th of August. Almost all of my paternal cousins live in the US, so most of my time was spent amongst elders, with my father. I sat and listened.
The tread on the father, there's this edge. The corners are edged, so your hand can go smoothly.
Don't bother about those.
But then, so that becomes also a risk factor.
You see? No, they want it to break, so that you come back.
Yeah.
They believe technology is conspiring against them. Being the youngest adult in the room is odd. On one hand, it's your right to speak. On the other, speaking is a privilege. If you show no understanding, you're a fool, but if you show too much, you can be seen as disrespectful. My cousin, Princewill, was 35 when he died. He was one of 4 and the only son to his parents. He got married in 2017, so now his new bride is a widow. Everyone felt his death. I felt it, and I can't say I knew him. There's only one person I'm not sure felt it, his mother, Auntie Ngozi. It had been over a month since he passed, and the family had yet to tell her. You see, my aunt's been ill for a while. The pain started as a surge that intermittently shocked her body, but the last time I saw her, she couldn't even recognize me. She barely recognized my father, her brother. It's crazy how an illness can begin as one thing and turn into something else entirely.
Every day by day, nothing will harm you when he leads the way.
They planned to tell her of Princewill's death when she got better, but the time never came, and either way it'd be wicked to tell a woman so fragile that her pride and joy, her only son, had been killed by a downfield driver during his lunch break.
Thank you for your mercies and your kindness.
They sing with lungs that are scarred from screams. They pray on bruised knees.
Bless your name. And we say to our soul, bless the Lord, O my soul, and all that is within me. Bless his holy name.
My dad held his sister tenderly. Fear and faith circled around the room like a tornado, and I was in its path. I'm sure if I asked my dad what he felt in that moment, he wouldn't admit to the fear, only faith. But I could see the fear. I could see his humanity. On August 29, 2018, I fell in love with a woman I never knew existed, my dad's sister, on Cecilia, perhaps one of the most beautiful women I've ever met. She told me she loved me, and I loved her too.
Into my eyes. This remember how I was beating you with Zuzo?
Over the years, I've built walls to protect myself from family. Family is one of those things that you don't have a say in. They're there by default. Asserting themselves in your personal matters, needing things from you, seeing you at your lows, and even when you're at your highs, they know that you wet the bed until you were 13, so when the time is right, they'll remind you of your place. Learning your family is an odd process. You figure you already know them since you've known them for so long, but you don't. And for me, understanding is a prerequisite to love. I couldn't accept that someone would love me a few hours from meeting me because there's no way she could understand me yet. Me, with my well-guarded doors. But when I felt the heart of this woman, I couldn't shake the innate connection I had with her. Someone I may never see or hear from again. My concept of family, of love, of understanding was challenged. Which led me to question what I really understood about my father. My father was born on November 26, 1956.
There are so many of them, and they are so exuberant, the Biafrans.
His family lived in the north in Enugu until the Nigerian Civil War, the Biafran War, broke out in the mid-60s.
One of this army's other problems is staying large enough to continue the fight against Nigerians. When Biafra seceded in 1967, it had fewer than 1,000 men under arms.
In the U.S., we have what is known as Black Friday. We celebrate this day by raiding Targets and Walmarts.
Whoa! Hey! Oh, damn!
That is going to go viral, Jerry.
For the Igbos, we have what is known as Black Thursday, September 29th, 1966, the peak of massacres in the north. My father was 10 when his family fled from the north and returned to Umuahia, Abia State. He says they fled with only what they could carry on their heads. The war had robbed years of school from him and his siblings and turned his mother into a widow. My grandfather, Nathan Umecharuba, one of the 3 founding fathers of the Assembly God Church in Nigeria, a civilian by all means, was slain with a machete and thrown into a ditch. They held no funeral for him. During war, there's no time for funerals. He says he wasn't able to assess his inner turmoil until he came to America. Did he lock the door of his heart for all those years? Is dealing with emotions a luxury of the first world, a luxury of those who live in peace? And how does war and the atrocities associated with war, such as being starved into submission, affect faith?
So the atmosphere of heaven is the glory.
How am I to see through eyes that have seen so much? How can we, being a world apart, not only communicate, but connect? This is the home my father grew up in. The home his family was forced to flee to during the war. This is the home my grandfather built, and in this very yard my grandmother's corpse rests. This is the closest I've ever been to her. My siblings and I never met her before she died. This is my home. I watched as my aunt shuffled the weeds that grew above Mama. I begged her to let me help, but she refused. She said I'd bruise my hands. I looked at my palms. They've never been soft. I went to prove myself, but the look in her eyes said you're not built like me. She's right. She lives in this compound where chickens run across the yard like squirrels. I wonder if these chickens cross the road, will they get to the other side? I don't know, but I know I'm not sweet. That yard is mine to fix because this is my home.
They want to come over.
Put a nice face on, I take a picture. Tia in America.
Yeah. Joshua. I got you.
That's good.
Okay.
They don't want to follow you to America.
Yeah, no, I'm not bad.
On the day of my cousin's funeral, I woke up at 6 a.m. with a rumbling stomach. I tried to fart, but I sharted instead and wet my undies. I would later learn that I had food poisoning and malaria. The videographer my Uncle Tony hired carried a big light, which intruded on our morning. He stuck his camcorder in my father and cousin's faces. I thought he was tasteless and had no class. I wanted to break his light, but then I remembered he was just doing his job.
For death, Lord, could not hold him captive, for even in the grave, Jesus, I know you are Lord, even in the grave, Papa Jesus.
You are the best judge.
I wondered how my Uncle Tony was coping with his sick wife and his only son dead.
We commit the entire family, especially your son and your daughter, into your hand. The uncommon grace to handle this situation. Let it rest upon him. Amen. Be thou glorified. Amen.
I struggled to record this day. The fever kicked in on top of my running stomach.
I'm not happy at time. People that were around me yesterday know how much I cried. I cried, and I cried very hard. You can't pinch me a little and I won't faint. But I'm not crying because I have any questions against God. If you can ask him questions, go ask him. I don't have that courage to ask God questions. He lives in heaven and the earth is his footstool. How big is God? Who are you to ask him questions?
My body was burning, yet I had cold sweats. In the middle of my dad introducing me to relatives, I started crying uncontrollably. I could barely walk and I thought I was gonna die. He held me. That night, he was the nurse at my side. Despite everything going on, he made me his primary focus. And despite all my reservations, I knew he was the only person who would sacrifice everything to see me well. If my father were a character, then I guess his fatal flaw would be his strength. He's had to be strong for so many, for so long. But whose shoulders bear the tears of the mighty?
God hit me, and took me through the wilderness. It's been like 40 years, but I'm still standing. Glory be to God.